Hello, my name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and the academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group. Today we are discussing Hannah Arendt's book On Revolution, and we are in chapter 3, The Pursuit of Happiness. The Pursuit of Happiness follows her earlier chapter, The Social Question, and in The Social Question, she argues that professional revolutionaries have taken over the idea of revolution, and in doing so, they have focused on the question of poverty and politicized poverty, so that poverty is seen as something caused by oppression, not something natural. And revolutions are not simply about founding freedom, but about overcoming the necessities of the body and thus overcoming poverty. And it's this move from freedom to necessity that she talks about in that chapter. The Pursuit of Happiness chapter begins by saying we need to not only look at professional revolutionaries, but also look at what she calls the men of the revolution. And in talking about these men of the revolution, the argument overarching is going to be that whatever they thought before the revolutions, and they thought many different things, they only became revolutionaries in the sense that they were pursuing a new idea of freedom, the foundation of freedom, in the act of revolution. And what they experienced in the act of revolution was a kind of happiness, a kind of public happiness, the happiness of participating in a revolution, in participating in self-government. And it was this experience, this taste of a new kind of freedom, not simply freedom from oppression or freedom from tyranny, but actually freedom of deliberating, discussing, and governing. Not freedom from poverty, but freedom of appearing and being visible and mattering in public. And that this new freedom that the men of the revolution, not professional revolutionaries, not theorists, but the men of the revolution experienced, is for Arendt deeply important in understanding the idea of a revolution. The first main point that she makes along these lines is that revolutions can happen only when there is a loss of authority, only when power is dissolved. And so she says on page 106 to 107, generally speaking, we may say that no revolution is even possible where the authority of the body politic is truly intact, and this means under modern conditions where the armed forces can be trusted to obey the civil authorities. So this is an important point in that as long as the armed forces, the police, and we might even add the bureaucracy and the administrative state is willing to support the political rulers, we're not in a revolutionary situation. Authority still exists. There's still the basic presumption that authority is to be obeyed. And as long as that happens, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to have a revolution. Revolutions happen when that authority breaks down and when the institutions of power begin to rebel or mutiny in some way. And when that happens, she says, revolutions actually occur with remarkable ease. She says on page 107, the men who make them first only pick up the power of a regime in plain disintegration. I think one of the phenomena that we've witnessed recently is that whether it's the Tea Party on one side or the Occupy movement in the United States and internationally on the other, there's been some people who think that we're in a revolutionary situation, that things are really breaking apart. And there certainly is a lot to say. I think there's a real loss of faith in the institutions and of the democratic institutions of this country and others. And yet there's an enormous authority that these political institutions still have. The army and the police are still far from rebelling or refusing uh, to participate in rule, and that raises a question of why and what would be required to make that different. Um, and in the 1960s, Arendt, in an interview that's published at the end of the book, Crises of the Republic, she writes, the loss of power and authority by all great powers is clearly visible, even though it is accompanied by an immense accumulation of the means of violence in the hands of the governments. But the increase in weapons cannot compensate for the loss of power. Nevertheless, this situation need not lead to revolution. For one thing, it can end in counter-revolution, the establishment of dictatorships, and for another, it can end in total anticlimax. It need not lead to anything. So you can have a loss of power, and yet it may not lead to anything. And I think one of the questions that she asks, and we need to ask, is why. And in that essay, in that interview at the end of Crises of the Republic, she says, she offers an answer, and I think it's one that deeply needs to be considered, which is that we will only move from a revolutionary situation to a revolution when there are people prepared to pick up the power. What does that mean, to be prepared to pick up the power? She says, again, in the Crisis of the Republic, quote, "At the moment, one prerequisite for a coming revolution is lacking: a group of real revolutionaries. The revolutionaries are those who know when power is lying in the street and when they can pick it up. Armed uprising by itself has never yet led to a revolution. Nevertheless, what could pave the way for a revolution, in the sense of preparing the revolutionaries, is a real analysis of the existing situation, such as used to be made in earlier times." And to me, this is really the insight that Arendt here brings to bear, which is that we need what she calls a real analysis of the existing situation. In that essay, when she's talking about the 60s, she's saying that to the extent we have quote-unquote revolutionaries talking about Marxism or third worldism or violence, she thinks they're just spouting cliches, they're old ideas that have nothing to do with the real situation, and as a result, they can't possibly pick up the power in the streets because they don't have the support of the people. They support they're professional revolutionaries. They have ideas, but they don't have a real analysis that would actually lead to support and power. And this chapter, chapter 3, the pursuit of happiness, is about the earlier times when the men of the revolution, as opposed to the professional revolutionaries, actually engaged in a real analysis of the situation. She calls these men of the revolution the hommes de lettres, the men of letters. She says these were people who went to school and studied the old ideas of freedom. And their real analysis of the situation was that we needed a new idea of freedom. And what she thinks these men of the revolution came to see and understand, first by study and second by experience, was this new idea of freedom, which she calls the pursuit of happiness. So the second point that I want to make in this chapter is that she first says that the key to the American and French Revolution, these new revolutionaries, was not an idea. It wasn't an ideology. It wasn't even an idea, but she says it was an experience. And it was, she says, the taste and experience of freedom. And this was especially true in America. So on page 110, she writes, quote, "What was a passion and a taste in France clearly was an experience in America. and the American usage, which especially in the 18th century spoke of public happiness, where the French spoke of public freedom, suggests this difference quite appropriately. The point is that the Americans knew that public freedom consisted in having a share in public business, and that the activities connected with this business by no means constituted a burden, but gave those who discharged them in public a feeling of happiness they could acquire nowhere else. The people went to the town assemblies, neither exclusively because of duty, nor, and even less, to serve their own interests, but most of all because they enjoyed the discussions, the deliberations, and the making of decisions. This public business that Americans throughout the colonies, but especially in New England, were actually engaged in self-government, was for them fun. They enjoyed it. They didn't do it simply out of self-interest. It wasn't a burden, but it gave them a feeling of happiness, public happiness. And nowhere in Europe were these institutions set up. Now, during the Revolution and in the revolutionary committees, people began to experience this, even in France and in Europe. But the Americans had a more in-depth and richer experience of it for her. And that this led, both in France and in America, to a linguistic distinction, which is one that is very hard to understand, I think, when I teach constitutional law, always difficult, but it's between a republic and a democracy. And one of the things is that both the French Revolution and the American Revolution did not speak of a democracy, creating a democracy. They spoke of creating a republic. And Arendt makes a distinction which I think is important. She says, if we wish to draw the line in purely linguistic terms, we might insist on the relatively late date of the word democracy, which stresses the people's rule and role, as opposed to the word republic with its strong emphasis on objective institutions. And people always try and give a definition of a republic versus democracy, and it's been very confused. And here's Arendt's version, which is that a republic is a government based on institutions, whereas a democracy is based on the rule of the people. So what are the institutions of a republic? Well, they are the institutions in which people come together and busy themselves with the business of government in a way that is enjoyable and fun. As I mentioned before, she talks about these men of letters, these hommes de lettres, and these were, chiefly people like Montesquieu, and then later. But what she's interested in is the way these people, how they inspired the revolution, and she does an interesting sociological analysis. On the one hand, these men were not poor. They had social standing. They were in the courts. But they withdrew from society. They gave up their privileges. They gave up their high standing and all that came with it, and chose seclusion. And these were people who then sat in their rooms and read the Greek and Roman authors. And they wrote about freedom. Why did they do that? Why did they give up their positions? And she says that they wanted to nourish their passion for significance and freedom. They came to not value social standing and those privileges that came with it. And they turned back to the Greek and Roman authors for eternal wisdom, she says. Not for eternal wisdom, but, quote, on page 114, to learn about the political institutions to which these authors bore witness. It was their search for political freedom, not their quest for truth, that led them back to antiquity. So these men of letters turned back to antiquity not for truth, but to experience and understand freedom. And so when I said that the 1960s revolutionaries weren't prepared, they hadn't done an analysis of the situation, what Arendt is saying is that these men of letters sort of lived a comfortable life and could have lived a very comfortable life, and yet they didn't find it meaningful. And they turned back not just to find truth, but to understand what was meaningful. And what they found was meaningful was this new idea that they came up with, this new idea of public freedom. And so on 115, she writes, public or political freedom and public or political happiness were the inspiring principles which prepared the minds of those who then did what they had never expected to do. Their importance to the context of revolution is great. It lies in the fact that they used the term freedom with a new and hitherto almost unknown emphasis on public freedom, an indication that they understood by freedom something very different from the free will or free thought that the philosophers had known and discussed since Augustine. So first, they saw a new idea of freedom, right? Augustine and the philosophers had always seen freedom as associated with free will. I have the freedom to move my hand up and down, to turn my head. I have the freedom to do this video or not. It's a free will question. And Arendt says that what these people understood is that freedom is not just free will. It's the doing the business of politics. She calls it political freedom. It's the freedom to participate and be in public in ways that matter. And this new political idea of freedom is the analysis of the situation, that suddenly people start saying, we want to matter. And this goes back to the discussion of John Adams in chapter 2, where Arendt comes to understand that the human need is not simply for wealth or comfort or luxury. It's for significance. It's to matter. And that's the analysis of the situation that she sees these men of letters doing, which prepares them to inspire the revolutionaries. These men of letters and this new idea of public happiness and freedom leads to, for Arendt, a triad between what she calls the active foundation, which demands a constitution and which needs a revolution. Foundation is the foundation of a public space in which the passion for freedom can be practiced. Constitutions become the way this public space is constituted, because they are assemblies where people come together and act in public, and they provide a boundary. They provide a framework where this new political realm, this public space, can exist. And as she has tried to argue here, this doesn't just happen through ideas. It happens through an experience. It's because of the experience of participating in public, in a constitutional convention, in a revolution, where people come to matter, that Arendt sees this new idea of freedom as a participatory public business pursuit of happiness coming to be. And yet, she says it fails, both in France and more ambiguously in the United States. And so she says that we can trace the failure of this founding, constituting, revolutionary moment through Thomas Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness. And so let's just recall for ourselves the words of the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the traditional formulation is life, liberty, and property. And Jefferson switches out property and replaces it with the pursuit of happiness. Arendt goes through a number of pages where she discusses the history of these words, the pursuit of happiness, and talks about how they were somewhat ambiguous. But she believes that for Jefferson and for many of the American revolutionaries, the pursuit of happiness had a very important connection with what she understands as public freedom, this participatory freedom. And she finds evidence of this in a number of places. One of my favorite quotes here on page 122 is her citation of a letter from Jefferson to John Adams, where she writes, quote, Jefferson's true notion of happiness, so what he means by, in her words, the pursuit of happiness, comes out very clearly when he lets himself go in a mood of playful and sovereign irony, and concludes one of his letters to Adams as follows: May we meet again in Congress with our ancient colleagues and receive with them the seal of approbation. Well done, good and faithful servants. And Arendt continues, here behind the irony we have the candid admission that life in Congress, the joys of discourse, of legislation, of transacting business, of persuading and being persuaded, were to Jefferson no less conclusively a foretaste of eternal bliss to come than the delights of contemplation had been for medieval piety. It was in Congress, where one debates, persuades, acts, governs, that Jefferson found heaven. And this idea of happiness, this heavenly idea of debating and acting in Congress, is for Arendt very much what Jefferson's words, the pursuit of happiness, meant, at least in their true sense. And yet, as I said, she thinks that they in large part failed. And so on 117 to 18 she writes, a suggestion pointing to the forces that caused this failure can be found in the very term pursuit of happiness that Jefferson himself in the Declaration of Independence had put instead of property in the old formula life, liberty, and property, which currently defined civil as distinct from political rights. So why do they fail? Why? And the answer for Arendt is that the pursuit of happiness in the end was always ambiguous. Even though there was this one sense of it as public happiness, there was always another sense. On one hand, public happiness. On the other hand, welfare, security, absence of poverty, social happiness. And then thus on 123 she can write, quote, the Declaration of Independence, though it blurs the distinction between private and public happiness, at least still intends us to hear the term pursuit of happiness in its twofold meaning, private welfare as well as the right to public happiness, the pursuit of well-being as well as being a participator in public affairs. So there's this double sense. On the one hand, public happiness means pursuit of happiness means public happiness. On the other, private. On the other hand, on one hand, prosperity. On the other hand, freedom. And it's this blurring, which on the one hand has over time held out in America and kept the possibility of an idea of public freedom alive, but on the other hand has constantly been confused with the American dream as the pursuit of a kind of private happiness, a happiness based in, as she says, milk and honey. And so she says this ambiguity leads to the ever endangerment of the revolution as a revolution for public happiness and freedom. And thus on 127 to 28, She writes, "The outcome of the American Revolution, as distinct from the purposes which started it, has always been ambiguous, and the question of whether the end of government was to be prosperity or freedom has never been settled. In the language of the founders, the question was whether the supreme object to be pursued was the real welfare of the great body of the people, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, or if it was rather the principal end of government to regulate the passions to excel and to be seen, which in turn becomes the principal means of government." So here she's citing John Adams again, and again she sets this ambiguity up. Is the American government to create freedom, or is it to create welfare and the happiness for the greatest number? And she thinks that this ambiguity has lasted and yet has been endangered because the American dream has been increasingly seen as a dream for luxury, consumption, consumerism. And so she says on page 130 to 131, the American dream, and here she's talking about the dream that lures immigrants and people to America and also inspires people here, was neither the dream of the American Revolution, the foundation of freedom, nor the dream of the French Revolution, the liberation of man. It was, unhappily, the dream of land where milk and honey flow. And this becomes the corrupting influence that brings us away from public happiness and freedom and back towards the social question, poverty, necessity, and an older idea of freedom, not the new idea of freedom that she saw rooted in Jefferson's idea of the pursuit of happiness. So that's, I hope, a helpful introduction to Chapter 3 on the pursuit of happiness, and I look forward to discussing it with you. Thank you very much.